Welcome to a slower kind of journey, one where history doesn't rush and memory doesn't demand to be understood.
Here, time moves softly, like a quiet tide brushing the edge of forgotten shores.
There are no battles waiting, no victories to recall, no voices shouting across the centuries. Only the faint echo of footsteps, slow, even, unhurried, marking the rhythm of time itself. In the stillness of the night, when the world outside grows gentle, your breathing becomes the metronome of the past. You and time side by side, moving through moments that no longer ask to be remembered. These are the stories that rest beneath the dust, the lives that once glimmered like embers before fading into shadow. Civilizations have risen and fallen, each leaving behind whispers, traces of their laughter, their laws, their quiet hopes. Every stone once touched by human hands carries a kind of memory, patient and wordless, waiting for someone to listen. Tonight, we listen, not to learn, not to judge, but simply to be still. As you breathe in, imagine the air filled with the scent of old paper and rain on stone. As you breathe out, let the weight of the day fall away. There is no need to think or to reach or to understand. You are only drifting gently between what once was and what will never return. Let the voice guide you through distant empires, across quiet oceans, into the soft hum of the human story. There is beauty in the silence, comfort in the slowness, peace in knowing that everything eventually rests. So close your eyes, loosen your thoughts and listen. The night will keep you safe, and history, in its gentlest form, will keep you company. Ancient Rome, the quiet face of punishment. In the old heart of Rome, when the air was thick with dust and heat, law was not written in mercy, but in stone. Every street carried its own silence, every wall its own story. Justice, in that world, was an idea shaped by the hands of men who feared disorder more than cruelty. To them, punishment was not anger, it was structure, a way to remind each citizen where they stood within the vast design of empire. Far below the city, in the cool darkness beneath the stones, there were chambers meant for solitude. A person who had broken the sacred rule of belonging could be led there. The walls were smooth, the air still, the entrance sealed with care. Inside, a small loaf, a small cup of water, nothing more. It was not death by violence, but death by absence, the removal of sound, of light, of witness. The city above continued its rhythm, the markets opened, the fountains flowed, and one life faded quietly beneath their feet. In Rome, to be separated from the community was the deepest silence of all. Along the banks of the Tiber, another sentence awaited a different kind of offender. It was called Poena Cullei, the punishment of the sack. The condemned was bound not alone, but with others that did not speak his language, a dog, a rooster, a snake, and a monkey. The animals stirred, confused by confinement, the sack drawn closed, the ropes tied firm. Then the bundle was carried to the river, where the current accepted everything without judgment. No cries were heard, only the soft splash of water swallowing the weight of law. The Romans believed that some crimes disturbed the balance between parent and child, and only nature itself could carry that disorder away. There were times when the cross waited, not upright, but inverted. The wooden beams, rough and heavy, leaned against the horizon of dust. The body was fastened, not in glory, not in spectacle, but as a symbol of rule and consequence. Hanging upside down, the world turned slow, the blood moved differently, and the breath learned a new shape. It was not quick, but it was certain, and in the stillness between heartbeats, the law spoke in silence again. For the soldiers of Rome, loyalty was measured not in words, but in endurance. When a legion faltered, when fear entered their lines, the punishment was called decimation. 10 men stood together, and by the turn of chance, one was chosen. The others became his executioners, carrying out the sentence without voice or question. The act was not rage, it was mathematics, the empire's way of reminding every soldier that the whole was greater than the part. When it was over, those who remained shared a smaller ration of bread, slept outside the walls, and carried the memory quietly for the rest of their service. Discipline was restored, and silence followed once more. Sometimes the sentence did not require death, only stillness. A slender iron tool shaped like a fork rested between the chest and the chin of the condemned. Its 2 points held the head in place, forcing the gaze forward, forbidding speech. Days could pass in this posture, the body learning the weight of its own quiet. The punishment was simple. One could neither look down in shame nor lift the head in pride. Only stillness remained, a lesson written not in words, but in the ache of muscles that could no longer move. On the southern edge of the Capitoline Hill stood the Tarpeian Rock, high and sheer, overlooking the city that had grown from legend. Those declared traitors were brought to its edge. There was no ceremony, no farewell. The guards performed their duty, and gravity did the rest. The wind carried the sound away before it reached the forum. To fall from that height was not merely to die, but to be unmade. To have one story end at the boundary between loyalty and air. Rome kept its peace through such moments, believing that the city must remain clean of betrayal. When the crowd gathered for the games and the gates of the arena opened, punishment became part of spectacle. Damnatio ad bestias was the name, condemnation to the beasts. The condemned stood on the sand, the sunlight burning on stone, the scent of dust and iron all around. The animals entered, not with malice, but with hunger. What followed was swift, inevitable, and loud, though the memory of it faded by nightfall. For the Romans, this too was order, the reminder that the empire's peace was maintained through the careful balance between control and fear. The ordered silence of the noble death. In the upper circles of Roman life, where marble floors reflected the light of quiet gardens and letters carried the weight of fate, punishment sometimes arrived not through soldiers or crowds, but through a single message. It was written on fine parchment, sealed with wax, and delivered with care. The words were few, the meaning unmistakable. A reminder from the emperor himself that the time had come to conclude one story with dignity. For men of rank, death was not always inflicted, it was invited. A blade, a bath, and silence. That was the path offered to those who had once held honor and now stood in its shadow. The empire preferred its endings to be orderly. To resist was to invite humiliation, to accept was to preserve a trace of name and legacy. The home would be sealed, the family allowed to remain. In a city where memory outlived flesh, such control over one's own departure was considered a final act of obedience. It was said that the philosopher Seneca met his end in this way, though the tale has softened with time. The image endures. A quiet room, a calm face, water cooling in a basin, the faint trace of conversation fading into air. There was no spectacle, no cry for mercy, only the steady rhythm of breath slowing, the voice of law speaking in its most polite form. In Rome, to die by one's own hand was not defeat. It was participation in the design of order itself. Beyond the marble, in the dust of the streets and the camps, punishment took simpler shapes. The wooden donkey, a beam sharpened to an edge, stood in public squares and military grounds alike. To sit upon it was to learn the patience of pain. The body rested where it could not rest, the balance delicate, the hours slow. Weights were sometimes tied to the ankles, pulling gently, drawing a thin line between lesson and endurance. It was not a spectacle for cruelty, but for memory. The passerby would look and remember the rule. The punished would sit, suspended between sky and stone, learning that stillness could cut deeper than motion. It was less about the suffering itself and more about the quiet that followed, a silence that reminded everyone watching that Rome valued order above comfort. Sometimes the donkey was made of metal, sometimes of wood, sometimes warm to the touch, sometimes cold. Its purpose never changed: to teach the difference between belonging and defiance. Those who endured it were rarely the same after, but in the city's vast machinery, they returned to their work, and the empire moved on. Across Rome, another mark of order waited, a symbol, not of death, but of permanence. It was branding, the punishment of skin. For those who had run from their masters, stolen from the market, or deceived the law, the letter was pressed into flesh with a heat that could not be forgotten. The iron met the face, or the arm, or the leg, leaving behind a sign that spoke louder than words. There were letters for thief, for liar, for runaway. They did not fade with time. They became part of the person, a quiet announcement carried into every market, every crowd. Rome believed in visible memory, that those who had failed the law should bear it openly. It was a way to write discipline into the body itself. The act was public, but calm. There were no speeches, only the sound of metal and breath. When it was done, the crowd dispersed. Life continued. For the branded, every reflection became a reminder, every gaze an echo of judgment. It was not death, but a slower form of disappearance. And yet beneath the cruelty there was a logic. The empire sought to preserve its rhythm. The punishment was not meant to destroy, only to mark. To remind that order was a visible thing, drawn not only in stone or on parchment, but upon the very surface of human life. In Rome, memory and punishment were one. The tongue and the bone, the empire's quiet power. There were moments when Rome chose silence as both weapon and teacher. Words had power, and those who misused them could be made to learn the cost of sound. The tongue, that small and restless muscle, was sometimes taken away from those who spoke against rule, a punishment not of anger, but of design. It ended the noise before it could begin again. Afterward, there was only breathing, soft and unformed, a reminder that speech itself was a privilege granted by the state. The act was swift, the reasoning unspoken. In a world built on order, silence was safer than debate. The city continued to hum around the punished, and life went on. People passed them in the street, eyes lowered, hearing only the quiet that followed where words used to be. Rome taught that control could exist in absence, the absence of sound, of protest, of expression. In the hush that remained, the empire felt steady again. When the body itself was judged, there was another method, older, slower, and strangely deliberate. It was called the breaking of bones, or the wheel. A man was laid upon the rim of a great circle, the limbs spread outward, the joints exposed. A hammer met each limb with calculated rhythm, never in rage, always in measure. The intent was not speed, but completion, a pattern repeated until motion ceased. This was the empire's purest silence, a mechanical ending carried out with patience. No crowd shouted, no music played. When it was over, the body remained upon the wheel, as though pinned in place by time itself. The sun passed, shadows lengthened, and Rome continued to breathe. The message was simple. Structure endured, flesh did not. Some punishments came not from the sword, but from heat. Ash, when hot enough, could suffocate. There were times when the condemned was buried up to the neck, a funnel placed at the mouth, and fine ash poured slowly downward. The particles filled each breath, gentle at first, then heavy, then absolute. It was said that the person felt no sharp pain, only the slow fading of air. To the Romans, this was an artful death, a method that left the world unblemished, the ground unstained, the sky unbroken. Others were wrapped in cloth soaked with oil or pitch, garments that gleamed in torchlight. When the flame was set, it moved like water, bright and consuming, but distant to those who watched. These acts belonged to the realm of ceremony, less about vengeance, more about control of space and image. Fire in Rome was both cleanser and signal. When the burning ended, there was little left to remember, only smoke joining the night. The city did not dwell on these things. They were not considered cruelty, only maintenance. The empire saw itself as a great mechanism, and each sentence was another cog turning in the machinery of order. The punished were not individuals but reminders, silent witnesses to the law's endurance. Ash, fire, and forgetting. In the final years of certain reigns, punishment reached beyond the body. It touched memory itself. When a ruler wished to erase a name, to unmake a presence, he decreed damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. Statues were pulled from pedestals, faces carved away from reliefs, names chipped out of stone. Coins were melted, inscriptions scraped smooth. The person's existence became a space, an emptiness where identity once stood. It was a punishment without pain, but complete. Families learned not to speak the forbidden name, records omitted it, generations passed without trace. In Rome, to be forgotten was the truest death. The empire understood that memory was power, and to remove it was to reclaim control over history itself. The city continued to shine in marble and bronze, but somewhere beneath that surface, thousands of stories had been erased. The wind passed over them, indifferent. The markets opened, the senators spoke, the legions marched, and the world continued as though those people had never lived. The silence of forgetting was perfect. It required no executioner, no witness, no aftermath, only time. Time, the patient servant, carried out the sentence without fail, and when night fell over Rome, covering the stones and statues, it seemed for a moment that the city itself rested, content in its stillness. The punishments, the ceremonies, the laws, all dissolved into the same quiet rhythm. The empire slept within its own memory, vast and calm, as if nothing had ever disturbed it at all.
The quiet echo of order.
In the end, the punishments of ancient Rome were not only acts of control, but reflections of a belief that pain could shape order and silence could preserve peace. To them, suffering was not chaos, it was structure, a necessary motion within the design of power. Centuries have passed, and the stones that once watched those acts have softened beneath moss and time. The iron has rusted, the names have blurred, the memories have become stories, whispered without urgency. Now when we look back, we do not feel fear or judgment, only distance. What once was lore has turned to echo. What once was horror has become history. The city still stands, patient beneath the sun, its ruins breathing the same slow rhythm they always did. And as night folds over them, there is no sound of pain, only the quiet hum of a world long gone, resting in the calm that follows all things. The peace that waits at the end of every empire when the noise has faded and only silence remains. The turning of time. The centuries drifted onward, slow as dust settling in the corners of forgotten rooms. The voices of Rome grew softer, their echoes stretched thin beneath the weight of years. What once had been command and empire faded into memory, into ruins gently warmed by the sun. The marble cracked, the statues leaned, and the air carried only the sigh of wind through empty arches. History exhaled, and the city slept. Far above the stones, time continued its quiet work. The world turned, and the horizon widened. Across the sea, new lands waited, wrapped in silence, shaped by wind and distance. The old world was ending, not with fire, not with the fall of walls, but with stillness, the kind that comes before a new beginning. If you listen closely, you might hear the faintest sound beyond the ruins, a creak of wood, the jingle of harness, the steady rhythm of hooves meeting earth. The air grows lighter, cooler, touched by open space. The hum of empire fades into the hush of wilderness. Day becomes dusk, and dusk becomes another dawn. The roads of stone give way to trails of dirt and grass. The language of command gives way to the language of journey. Men and women move westward now, their wagons slow, their hopes steady. The sun no longer burns through marble, it sinks into endless plains, into wide rivers and unknown skies. The old order dissolves like smoke, and in its place rises something quieter. The promise of open land, of solitude, of the long patience of travel. The world has turned its page. The empire of walls and judgment is gone, replaced by the soft, breathing space of a frontier not yet named. And so we follow, drifting with them into the distance, where the wind carries the scent of dust and new beginnings. The past lies behind us, still and complete. Ahead, the land stretches on, waiting to be crossed, waiting to be heard. The American frontier, the quiet journey west. The wind was the first to arrive. It moved across the tall grass in long, patient waves, whispering through every open mile of land. Then came the sound of wheels, slow, deliberate, wooden circles turning against the soil of a world not yet claimed. The year was somewhere in the middle of the 19th century, though time itself seemed uncertain here, stretched thin beneath the sky. Across the horizon, the covered wagons drifted like pale clouds pulled along the earth. Their canvas tops swayed gently, catching the morning light, their wooden frames groaning softly with each movement. There was no music to lead them, only the rhythm of hooves, the creak of axles, and the steady sigh of wind. It was not a grand march, but a quiet migration, a long exhale of humanity into the open unknown. Each family carried more than belongings. They carried silence, endurance, and the slow, invisible weight of hope. Children walked barefoot beside the wheels, eyes following the endless line of dust. Mothers adjusted ropes, fathers walked with measured steps, and every face seemed turned toward something that could not yet be seen. Behind them, the old towns were already fading, their doors closing gently against the wind, their fires dimming to ash. The frontier began not with fences or markers, but with space, the kind of space that humbles the voice and steadies the heart. The land stretched in all directions without boundaries, without sound, except for the whisper of grass against leather and the low groan of wood beneath weight. At dusk, when the sun softened into gold, the wagons would draw into a circle, not for defense, but for belonging. The animals rested, the air cooled, and the travelers spoke in tones that barely rose above the wind. Somewhere beyond the glow of the campfires, a coyote called, its voice low and distant, as if speaking to the stars themselves. And above it all, the sky, vast, endless, unbroken, watched in silence. The journey west was not a conquest. It was a meditation, a slow surrender to the rhythm of earth and time, carrying its travelers deeper into the quiet heart of a new world. The dream of departure. Before the journey began, there was only an idea, a soft, persistent thought that whispered through the crowded towns and narrow streets of the East. It came to people in the quiet hours of the night, in the pause between work and sleep, in the wait of the same view seen too many times through the same small window. They called it opportunity, or sometimes simply land. But what they were truly searching for was space, a place where the air felt new, where a man could stand beneath the open sky and believe, for a moment, that the world had no walls. The dream spread slowly, carried by rumor, by letters, by the distant words of travelers who had seen rivers wide enough to swallow the horizon, soil so dark it seemed alive, and sunsets that bled into the earth without sound. The dream did not shout, it murmured. It spoke through the rustle of maps unfolded on wooden tables, through the creak of wagons being built in quiet barns, through the soft farewell of doors closing behind those who chose to leave. When they departed, there were no crowds to cheer, no banners waving. The leaving itself was an act of faith. Small groups moving westward into the unknown, drawn not by certainty, but by the whisper of possibility. Some went for land, others for freedom, others because the world behind them had become too small to contain their restlessness. Whatever the reason, they all looked toward the same light, the one that touched the horizon each morning and promised, without words, that there was more beyond. Life on the trail. The first days were full of motion. The creak of axles, the shuffle of hooves, the rhythm of feet pressing against the earth. The road was not a road at all, only a path worn thin by those who had passed before. Dust rose with every turn of the wheel, hanging in the air like memory. The sky was a constant companion, endless and patient, watching as the travelers grew smaller against its breadth. Food was measured in handfuls, water in careful sips. The mornings were bright, the afternoons long, the evenings stretched with the slow work of setting camp. Each family moved at its own pace, guided not by clocks but by the shape of the land, the curve of a river, the rise of a hill, the promise of a shaded grove. At night, the wagons were drawn into a loose circle, and small fires flickered in the hollow of the plains. The smoke drifted upward, thin and steady, carrying with it the scent of ash and quiet determination. There were days when the trail offered beauty, sunlight spilling across the grass, herds moving in the distance, the first glimpse of mountains wearing snow like a crown. And there were days when beauty vanished, when rain turned the ground to mud, when sickness spread quietly through the camp, when hunger spoke louder than hope. Yet even then, they continued. Not because they were fearless, but because there was nowhere left to return to. Children learned to walk in rhythm with the wagons. They learned the language of weather, the taste of dust, the sound of distance. The elders spoke less as the miles grew longer, their words replaced by a shared silence, a silence that understood the cost of every step. The journey west was not a story of triumph, but of endurance. It was made not by heroes, but by ordinary people who learned that progress often feels like standing still, that hope is sometimes just the decision to take one more step before nightfall. When storms came, they waited. When rivers rose, they built rafts from the parts of their own wagons, crossing carefully, watching the current pull at the wood. Sometimes they lost things, tools, animals, even people, to the weight of the journey. And yet, each morning, when the sky lightened again, the sound of motion returned, the slow, steady groan of wheels, the low murmur of voices, the quiet insistence of survival. The making of home. When the wagons finally stopped, it was rarely because the travelers had reached the end. It was because they had found a place where stillness felt possible. The land was wide and mostly empty, except for wind, grass, and the promise of water somewhere beneath the soil. There were no fences, no roads, only the idea of a future drawn in rough lines upon the earth. They began with wood, simple beams cut from trees that had stood longer than memory. The sound of axes filled the air, sharp and rhythmic, followed by the slow thud of logs falling to the ground. Houses rose from the dust, rough at first, then steady, each one a small declaration of permanence. Smoke began to climb from new chimneys, thin and uncertain, curling into the cold air of early winter. The days were long and the work unending. Hands cracked from cold, nails bent, roofs leaked when the wind shifted. But the land, in its vastness, offered something the old towns never had: silence that belonged to them alone. Each morning, frost shimmered on the grass. Each evening, the fires burned a little stronger. The sound of saws, of shovels, of breath became the music of survival. Winter was both enemy and companion. The snow fell without hurry, covering the ground in a pale hush. The walls of the small cabins held firm against the cold, though they creaked and sighed through the nights. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of smoke and pine resin. Wood cracked in the fire, a slow rhythm against the wind outside. Families gathered close, their voices low, their laughter faint but real. Outside, the land slept beneath a sky full of stars. When morning came, the world glittered in frost. Footsteps left soft impressions that vanished as the sun rose higher. The settlers stepped outside, their breath rising in thin clouds, and for a moment, everything was still. No sound, no movement, just the quiet heartbeat of a new beginning. They had not found paradise. They had found effort and solitude and the slow companionship of the land. But in the long quiet between sunrise and sunset, as the smoke curled gently from the chimney and the wind carried the scent of earth and snow, they realized that the dream was not in the destination. It was in the endurance, in the simple, endless act of staying. And as the night came down again, wrapping the cabins in its dark calm, the fire continued to burn, whispering its steady promise that even in the coldest places, warmth can be built, and even in silence, life can begin again. The women of the frontier. In the quiet story of the frontier, there were no heroes carved in stone, no names sung in songs, only those who worked without pause and spoke without pride. Among them, the women stood at the center, though they rarely stood still. Their hands were the rhythm of each day, kneading, stitching, planting, tending, their silence a kind of prayer to the earth. When the wagon stopped and the fires burned low, it was the women who kept the world from falling apart, their strength not loud but constant, woven into every small act of care. Morning began before the light, the sound of water poured into tin, the soft scrape of flour across a wooden board, the faint breath of wind moving through an open seam of the wagon. Children stirred, and the day began. They gathered the remnants of yesterday's meal, repaired torn clothing, and watched the horizon with eyes that measured distance differently, not in miles, but in chores, in seasons, in the slow rhythm of survival. When storms came, they were the shelter. When sickness spread, they were the medicine. When grief arrived, they were the silence that held it steady until it passed. Their names were not written in journals, but their presence filled every page. Without them, the trail would have been a line drawn too thin to survive the wind. At night, when the fires dimmed and the world turned blue beneath the moon, they sat quietly, mending clothes by the last flicker of flame. Their faces glowed faintly in the light, tired but steady. Around them the land stretched out, vast and indifferent, but within their small circle of warmth, there was order, there was tenderness, there was peace. They built homes from scarcity, comfort from nothing, hope from repetition. And though no one ever crowned them pioneers, they were the pulse of the new world, quiet, enduring, unbroken. The people of the wind and earth. Long before the wagons came, before the sound of iron wheels and foreign voices, the land already had its keepers. They lived in rhythm with wind and river, with the turn of the sun and the sleep of the stars. Their homes were not built of stone but of motion, their stories told in firelight and carried by memory. The frontier was not new to them. It was a name others gave to a place that had never been lost. As the settlers moved west, the two worlds touched, not with the thunder of armies, but with the slow friction of presence. Fields rose where grass once ran free. Fences traced the lines of ownership across land that had never known such borders. The old paths of buffalo vanished beneath the furrows of plows. Yet still in the distance, figures could be seen on horseback, quiet, watchful, as though observing a storm that could not be stopped. They moved not in defeat but in patience, retreating to the edges of rivers, into forests, into silence. The wind still carried their songs, though few could understand them now. Some sought to trade, others to warn, but most simply continued their lives as they always had, hunting, walking, gathering, speaking to the earth in the language it understood best, the language of respect. There were moments of kindness between strangers, shared food, exchanged words. There were also moments of fear, sharp and quick, when misunderstanding became distance, and distance became loss. The settlers saw land as promise, the people who lived there saw it as kin. To one, it was opportunity. To the other, it was life itself. When the fields grew, the old camps faded. Smoke rose no longer from the valleys where it once had. The people of the wind and earth stepped quietly backward until the horizon belonged once more to the silence they had always known. And yet, even in their absence, the land remembered them, in the way the wind moved, in the way the rivers curved, in the long, still patience of the plains. The law of the borderlands. In the far reaches of the frontier, where the land outnumbered the people and the nearest neighbor might be a day's ride away, law took a simpler form. It did not come from cities or governments, but from necessity. Justice was measured not by fairness, but by survival. The rule was clear and cold: protect what you have, take only what you must, and never forget that the land keeps its own record. There were no courthouses, only the weight of reputation. A person's word was as solid as a fence post, and breaking it could mean exile, not by decree but by distance. The frontier did not punish with jails or chains, it punished with isolation. To be left alone out there was to vanish slowly into the vastness, to be swallowed by wind and weather. Conflicts were settled quickly. A man's eyes, his silence, the angle of his hand resting near the belt. These were the courts, the trials, the verdicts. Sometimes justice was written in dust, erased by the next gust of wind. Sometimes it was left unspoken, a balance restored by the quiet understanding that every act carried a price. The people of the frontier lived close to the edge of everything: comfort, hunger, safety, loss. And so they made their peace with simplicity. A broken tool could mean death, a stranger's kindness could mean survival. The law became less about punishment and more about endurance. It was the understanding that order had to be carried within, not imposed from above. When night fell and the fires burned low, that law rested beside them like a second shadow, invisible but always present. It lived in the way they shared water, in the way they left food for a traveler, in the way they lowered their voices when the wind rose. It was a code born not of civilization, but of the wilderness itself. And as the stars stretched above the borderlands, quiet and endless, the settlers, the wanderers, and the watchers all lived beneath the same sky, bound by the same fragile agreement, that in this vast silence, survival was its own kind of justice. The coming of the Iron Road. The change did not come with thunder, it came with a hum. Low, steady, unfamiliar. At first, it was only a whisper beneath the wind, a distant vibration through the ground, a rhythm that did not belong to nature. Then one morning, the sound grew closer. Metal against metal, steam against sky. The first trains arrived like great iron animals, breathing smoke and fire, carrying within them the slow heartbeat of a new age. Across the plains where once only the wind had travelled, the rails began to gleam. Men followed their bright lines, hammering iron into soil, measuring distance by sound. Each strike was an echo of progress, deliberate, repeating, endless. The grass bent beneath the weight of steel, and the air, once filled only with birds and weather, now carried the sharp cry of whistles that pierced the horizon. The settlers watched in silence as the machine carved its way west. Some stood in awe, others with unease. The land that had once stretched without edge was now divided, cut into grids of property and purpose. The rhythm of the frontier, once the slow turning of wheels and the creak of leather, became the pulse of pistons, the hiss of steam, the metallic breath of progress. Alongside the rails came the telegraph, thin wires strung across the sky like dark threads of thought. Messages began to fly faster than wind, connecting towns that had never spoken, tying distances together with sparks and code. The silence of the plains filled with murmurs, news, orders, voices carried in lines of copper. The wilderness, once patient and untouched, began to listen to human sound. At night, the trains did not sleep. They passed through the dark with glowing eyes, trailing sparks into the wind, their engines sighing like restless beasts. The settlers would wake sometimes, hearing them far away, a deep metallic moan rolling across the fields. The old world was not ending in war or fire. It was ending in rhythm, in the steady repetition of wheels on track, in the hum of connection, in the long, measured breath of civilization arriving. The frontier that had once been wide and wordless began to change its shape. The towns grew closer, the pauses shorter, the stillness thinner. And though the land still stretched forever, its silence had been touched. The end of the frontier. By the last years of the 19th century, the horizon had been measured. Maps were complete. Every mile had been counted, every river named, every border drawn. What was once endless now fit neatly between lines of ink. The word frontier, once heavy with mystery, began to fade, its meaning slipping quietly out of language, out of time. The people who had once moved endlessly forward began to stop. Their wagons rested in barns, their wheels stilled by dust. The fields they had carved grew tall with wheat, the towns thickened with smoke and trade. Children who had been born on the trail now lived behind walls, went to school, learned to write the names of the places their parents had only known by direction: north, west, home. There was comfort in this stillness, but also a strange emptiness. For so long, movement had been purpose, the horizon a promise. Now, with nowhere left to go, the sky seemed wider but quieter, as if waiting for footsteps that would never come. The land itself seemed to sigh, the wind blowing over fences and roofs, searching for the open plains that had vanished beneath plough and road. In 1890, the government declared the frontier closed. It was a line drawn not upon the ground, but upon history. The age of wandering had ended, the unknown had been catalogued, the wilderness tamed, the silence broken. But for those who still remembered the journey, the sound of wheels in dust, the weight of solitude, the long companionship of sky, something in that declaration felt unreal. The land was still there. The horizon still breathed. Only the people had changed. As evening fell over the new towns, light spilled through windows and telegraph lines hummed softly in the distance. Trains still moved across the land, each whistle echoing like a memory of movement. Yet beyond the reach of light, the plains still stretched, vast, dark, eternal. The coyotes still called, the rivers still turned, and the wind, faithful as ever, carried on its endless path. Those who stood at the edge of the last measured field often turned west one final time. They saw no cities, no roads, only the long shadow of the setting sun. And as they listened to the wind moving through the grass, they understood that though the frontier had ended, its silence remained. Not gone, only hidden, folded beneath the noise of the new world, waiting for night to fall again.
When darkness settled, the stars appeared. The same ones that had watched the first wagons cross the plains, the same that had shone over the camps, the rivers, the unbroken trails. Their light did not change. Only the people below them had learned to move faster, to speak louder, to forget the language of stillness.
And yet, for those who listened carefully, beneath the hum of the rails and the pulse of the wires, the old rhythm could still be heard, faint, steady, eternal, the quiet heartbeat of the land that once carried them all westward, step by step, into the waiting silence. The breath between worlds. The trains fade into distance, their echoes swallowed by the night. The land grows still again, the air cools, and a soft wind moves through the dry grass, whispering over the empty tracks, carrying the scent of iron and dust. The voices of men, the noise of progress, drift away until only the breath of the earth remains. Now close your eyes. Feel the quiet weight of the horizon, endless and calm. The wind moves in rhythm with your breathing. In, gentle as dusk, out, slow as the turning of stars. The world exhales, and so do you. Each sound softens, each thought loosens its hold. This is the space between histories, between endings and beginnings. Here only stillness remains, the steady pulse of the earth, the soft hum of sleep. The history of human music, the breath of the world. Before there were words, there was rhythm. Before stories were spoken, they were felt. Pulsing quietly beneath the skin, echoing in the chest, carried through breath and heartbeat. The world began not in silence, but in pattern, in repetition, in the gentle insistence of sound. The first song was not sung, it was lived. It was the steady thrum of a heart finding its pace, the whisper of lungs learning to move with the air, the soft percussion of rain touching the ground for the first time. Somewhere in the deep past, before memory had shape, humankind listened. They did not yet name what they heard, the rustle of wind, the crackle of fire, the slow sigh of waves against rock. But their bodies remembered. The rhythm entered them, turning movement into meaning. The hands that shaped tools began to beat softly against stone, against wood, against skin. A pattern emerged, not planned, not written, just born, as naturally as breathing. The first instruments were not made, but found. A hollow bone, a stretched hide, a handful of dry seeds. Each sound a discovery, each echo a small miracle. The people gathered around firelight and felt the air move between them. In the glow and smoke, the world began to speak, not through language, but through vibration, through the steady rise and fall of tone. Music was not art then, it was life itself, a way to remember the rhythm of the earth, to make sense of the passing of day and night. It was the pulse that guided footsteps, the hum that carried through labor and rest, the sound that filled the silence between living things. Every creature had its own note, the bird with its call, the wind with its hum, the river with its low murmur. Humanity learned not to control these sounds, but to join them, to breathe in time with them. Perhaps it began with the simplest sound of all, the voice. A single tone held in the air, trembling, then breaking, then returning. The first song may have been nothing more than a sigh, a hum, a soft imitation of the wind in the grass. But within that breath was everything: joy, fear, loneliness, wonder. The heart beat faster when sound rose, slower when it fell. The rhythm of life and the rhythm of song became one. Over time, rhythm became memory. People used it to mark the hunt, to call the rain, to welcome the dawn. When one generation passed, the rhythm remained, repeating itself in the hands and breath of those who followed. The earth kept its tempo. Humanity kept listening. Even now, when you close your eyes, you can hear it. Faint but certain, beneath the noise of thought. The slow pulse that never stops. The ancient rhythm that still guides every heartbeat, every breath, every moment of stillness. The music of the world did not begin with invention. It began with attention. With the act of listening, the first symphony was not written, it was felt. The sky played its part, the ocean kept time, and somewhere deep within, the heart learned to join the song. And so the story of music begins, not with instruments or melody, but with life itself, moving in rhythm with the earth, forever keeping time with the quiet breath of the world. The first sounds. When the rhythm of life began to take form, humankind learned to shape the air. The voice was the first instrument, but soon the world itself became an orchestra. Bones left behind by hunted birds, hollow and light, were discovered to sing when breath passed through them. Someone, somewhere, lifted such a bone to their lips and exhaled, not out of purpose, but curiosity, and a note rose into the air. Thin, trembling, uncertain. It echoed across the valley, and the sound of the first flute was born. The people listened. They found that the sound could comfort, or call, or linger like smoke above the fire. From bones came melody, from stone came rhythm. The rocks themselves were shaped into hollow drums, struck with branches until they answered with a deep, patient sound. Over time, men and women began to arrange these stones by pitch, creating sequences, harmonies of earth and breath. There were also sounds from afar, echoes on mountain walls, the call of drums from another camp. Each distance had its rhythm. To hear it was to know that someone, somewhere, was alive, moving, listening too. In the beginning, music was not a performance. It was a way of belonging, of reminding one another that life continued beyond the edge of sight. The instruments were few, but they carried the weight of the world. A bird's bone, a piece of stone, a stretched animal hide, a hollowed tree branch. There were no audiences, only circles. People gathered around flame and darkness, creating sound not to entertain, but to remember. In those moments, the boundary between themselves and the land dissolved. The earth provided the instrument, humanity provided the breath. Together, they made song. The music of the early tribes. Music was not yet a language of beauty. It was a language of survival, of unity, of trust. The pulse of drums marked the coming hunt. The rising hum of voices sent prayers to unseen forces, not out of worship, but out of hope. A song could call the rain, could soothe a child, could carry grief into the night until it became bearable again. Every tribe had its rhythm. Some beat upon the ground to mimic thunder, others sang to the rivers in slow, winding tones. The elders knew the patterns and the young learned them by repetition. There was no word for musician, only keeper of sound. The role was sacred but not set apart. Everyone sang, everyone listened. In the cold seasons, when fire was the only light, the community became a single instrument. The steady tap of bone against drumskin, the layered hum of human voices, the rhythm of hands against wood. Together they created warmth where the world outside was silent. When dawn came, the music ended not with applause, but with quiet. The people stepped back into the rhythm of labor, the turning of soil, the carrying of water, the weaving of rope, and all of it followed the same unseen tempo. Music was the breath of the tribe, shared, repeated, and never owned. Mesopotamia, the gentle harp. In time, music followed civilization into the valleys of the great rivers. In Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates, sound began to take shape as craft. Clay tablets recorded notes, harps and lyres were built with strings drawn tight across carved wood, and their tones filled the air of temples and courts. The harp was the voice of the early cities, soft, shimmering, balanced. It accompanied stories of gods and kings, but also the small, private songs of workers who sang while grinding grain or carrying water. Music drifted through open windows, mixing with the sound of wheels and livestock, the heartbeat of a city learning to breathe together. The melodies were gentle, deliberate, mathematical even, yet still rooted in the pulse of the earth. Each note seemed to rise from the soil itself, carrying with it the scent of water and clay. Egypt, the bronze pulse of ceremony. Farther west, along the Nile, Egypt found its own rhythm, precise, ceremonial, eternal. The people there believed that sound could bridge worlds, that music was not merely heard, but felt by gods. In their temples, bronze clappers struck against one another, the sound sharp and pure, cutting through the air like sunlight through mist. The priests moved in patterns, the rhythm steady and repeating, while harps, flutes, and sistrums shimmered in time with breath. The music was not improvised. It was a structure, an offering, an echo of the great cycles of the sun and river. Each note honored the balance of the world, birth and decay, order and renewal. Yet outside the temples, the same sounds lived humbly. Farmers sang while sowing seeds, boatmen kept time with oars, children clapped along to the rhythm of the day. The sacred and the ordinary shared the same song. For Egypt, music was a mirror of life's harmony, the heartbeat of eternity, repeating softly against the shores of time. Greece, the ratios of harmony. In Greece, music began to think. The philosophers listened not only with the ear, but with the mind. They measured intervals, traced harmony through numbers, and found in sound a reflection of the cosmos. Pythagoras, it was said, heard the music of the spheres, the universe itself, vibrating in perfect ratio. The Greeks called it musike, the art that united sound, word, and movement. It was both science and spirit, the study of beauty through proportion. They played the lyre, the flute, and the kithara, each sound clear and structured, designed to please both reason and soul. In the theatres, music guided emotion. In the gymnasiums, it shaped discipline. In the temples, it carried prayers upward. Harmony was not just in sound, but in living, a life in tune with order. The Greeks believed that to live well was to be well-tempered, like an instrument tuned to the measure of the world. In every note, they sought not pleasure, but truth. Rome, the music of power and celebration. When Rome rose, it brought with it the sound of command. Music became louder, fuller, designed to move masses and mark triumph. Drums and horns led the legions through battle, the deep thrum of rhythm binding men into one heartbeat. Yet, even in victory, Rome loved its festivals. The same instruments that had marched to war now filled the streets with song. Flutes, cymbals, and voices echoed between marble walls, spilling into the night with laughter and wine. Music in Rome was not quiet or sacred. It was alive, a celebration of order, of conquest, of belonging to something greater than oneself. The empire's sound was not the gentle harp of Mesopotamia, nor the delicate ratio of Greece. It was the roar of the crowd, the cadence of feet, the brass call that told the world, "We endure." But beneath the ceremony, beneath the noise, the same ancient pulse remained. The heartbeat of humanity, still steady beneath the armor and applause. The rhythm of humanity. Through every age, through every language, music has remained, not as a possession, but as a pulse, a quiet thread running through the fabric of time. It has crossed oceans, outlived empires, and whispered through every kind of silence. Long before writing, long after memory fades, the rhythm endures. It does not ask to be understood, it only asks to be felt. When we listen closely, we realize that music never truly begins or ends. It flows through the lungs, through the soil, through the smallest gestures of life itself, a heartbeat, a footstep, the sway of a body at rest. All are fragments of an unbroken symphony that the world continues to play again and again beneath the noise of our days. The rhythm of humanity has no single tempo. It shifts with the seasons, with the pulse of work and sleep, with the movement of light across the walls of a home. In one corner of the world, it beats fast and bright, drums in the desert, voices rising into heat. In another, it hums slow and deep. The sound of water against stone, the steady pluck of strings under moonlight.
But wherever people live, they create rhythm, even without instruments, even without words. The soft clap of hands, the hum beneath breath, the tap of a heel against floorboards. Each is a way of saying, I am here. Music is the echo of presence, the sound of life proving itself quietly, gently, endlessly.
It does not need an audience, it does not seek perfection. It is simply the body remembering what the earth already knows, that everything alive moves in time. The flow through time. When we look back across centuries, what we call music is not a series of inventions. It is a single current winding through every human story. From the bone flutes of prehistory to the choirs of cathedrals, from the quiet harp of Mesopotamia to the hum of electric strings, it has never stopped flowing. Each generation adds its own tone, its own small variation on the same eternal pattern. Sometimes it grows complex, like a river splitting into many branches. Sometimes it returns to simplicity, a single voice, a single drum, a single heartbeat. And through all of it, the same rhythm endures, the steady, patient movement of time made audible. The songs change, the languages change, the instruments fade and reappear in new forms. Yet the emotion, the quiet ache that lives between sound and silence, remains unchanged. Music is not an invention of culture. It is a reflection of being itself. The world moves, and we move with it. Perhaps that is why every civilization, no matter how distant, has used music to mark its existence. The lullabies of mothers, the laments of the grieving, the chants of the workers, the calls of the shepherd, the dance of joy, all are notes in the same long composition. Humanity's collective breath exhaled across time. In this way, music is not bound to progress. It does not need to evolve to survive. It continues because the body continues, because the heart keeps its rhythm even when the mind grows still. It is both memory and moment, a bridge between what was and what is, carrying the essence of humanity forward in sound. The universal breath. There is a music that requires no melody, the kind that happens naturally without thought. The sound of rain against leaves, the wind moving through branches, the waves striking the shore in perfect rhythm with the heart. These are the songs the earth sings to itself, and we, for a time, are part of the chorus. Even in silence, there is rhythm. The pause between heartbeats, the faint pulse in the wrist, the rise and fall of breath while sleeping. This is the first rhythm we ever hear, before birth, within the dark sea of the body, and it is the last rhythm we leave behind. Everything in between is just variation, melody, movement. The rhythm is eternal. When people sit together in quiet, when they share food or light or laughter, they are keeping time without realizing it. The breath of one becomes the breath of all. The pace of speech, the tilt of the head, the soft timing of a shared glance, all follow unseen measures. Music, it seems, has never been separate from us. It has always been the way we exist together. Even now, in the age of machines and signals, we return to rhythm to find rest. We play soft music to sleep, steady tones to breathe, repeating loops to quiet the restless mind. Beneath the layers of technology, the ancient need remains to find the pulse of the world and let it carry us into stillness. The sound of stillness. If you listen carefully enough, you will find that the quietest sounds are the ones that last. The breath before a note, the echo after it fades, those are the true heartbeats of music. They remind us that sound exists only because of silence, that movement is only visible because of stillness. The rhythm of humanity is not only in the loud and living, but in the calm that follows. A mother's hum after her child sleeps. A single note sustained in the darkness of a temple. The sigh of wind through a forgotten street. All these are part of the same melody, not composed, but remembered. And so the music continues, soft and unending. It passes through generations like a shared heartbeat, through oceans and deserts, through sorrow and joy, always returning to its source. No matter where we are or how the world changes, we keep making sound, slowly, gently, faithfully, because the rhythm within us is the same rhythm that turns the stars. Music does not need words or purpose or perfection. It only needs breath. It only needs the steady pulse of a living heart. And in that rhythm, that quiet, eternal rhythm, the world finds its balance again. The same song that began before speech still plays now, softly, beneath everything. The same heartbeat that echoed in the caves of our ancestors still beats in every quiet room tonight. If you listen closely, you can hear it. The music of being alive, slow, even, and at peace. The sacred and the state. The music of faith and power. The voice of order.
As humanity learned to build cities, it also learned to build harmony. Where once there were scattered songs around fires, there were now great halls of sound, designed not just to be heard, but to remind people of something greater than themselves, not divine, but structured, human, enduring. Music became a language of balance and power, of rhythm held in place by design.
The rulers of the old worlds understood that sound could hold people together. A single drum beat could call men to gather, to march, to build. A steady rhythm could quiet fear. In the public squares and palaces, the sound of trumpets and horns rose above the noise of daily life, commanding attention, guiding motion, shaping emotion. The tones were precise, measured, repeating. It was not a music of beauty alone, but of order. The melody served as a mirror to the world's architecture, grand, deliberate, filled with symmetry. As laws were written, so too were compositions. Each note found its place within the system, and each pause carried weight. In these sounds, the human desire for permanence found voice. When people stood in silence before the music of their leaders, they were not asked to worship, but to listen, to hear the echo of control, the calm precision of unity. Sound, when organized, could build a world as surely as stone. Music as power. As kingdoms grew, music traveled with them, an invisible companion to the march of history. It was carried in the pockets of soldiers, in the memories of travelers, in the slow procession of processions and ceremonies. Drums signaled beginnings. Horns announced arrivals. Strings filled the air in the moments when the world paused to look upon itself. The powerful learned to shape feeling through sound. Victory sounded like brass and rhythm. Mourning like low strings and soft breath. Festivals required brightness, flutes and movement and the laughter of drums. Declarations were set to music because words alone could not fill the air so completely. Each city, each empire developed its own tone. Some preferred grandeur, choirs of instruments moving in waves like armies. Others preferred intimacy, a single voice or string line held long enough to echo against the walls of marble or clay. Music became not just a reflection of strength, but its performance. It turned command into ceremony. Yet beneath its structure, the old human pulse remained. The same heartbeat that once echoed in caves, now dressed in silk and steel. Even in the highest courts, the music still carried that quiet reminder. Power may build walls, but sound always finds a way to move through them. The order of sound. Over centuries, music became a way to express not chaos, but control. Notes were written down, measured carefully, placed into systems of counting. What was once instinct became mathematics. Sound, once wild, was drawn onto lines, scales, intervals, harmonies. This new language allowed memory to stretch beyond a single life. Songs no longer vanished with the singer. They could be recreated, identical and eternal. Across Europe, Asia, Africa and beyond, music began to form into patterns, not bound by belief, but by structure. In this world of measure, composers became architects of time. Each pause, each repetition, each return was planned. The listener was guided gently, step by step, through spaces of sound that felt as deliberate as cathedrals, though not bound to any faith. The goal was not devotion, but immersion, to remind the listener of balance, of proportion, of human design. Some pieces mimicked the turning of planets, others the motion of water, or the unfolding of thought. The result was both vast and intimate, a shared stillness made audible.
When an orchestra played, it was a conversation between order and emotion, between human discipline and the unmeasured current of life itself. Every note rose and fell like breath, reminding those who listened that structure could hold even the wildest feeling without breaking it.
The sound of the state. In time, as nations formed, the idea of unity found new expression through sound. Music became a borderless language that could speak of belonging, of home, of shared identity. Marches were written to guide the steps of armies, anthems to mark the rise of nations. But beyond battlefields and banners, the same principle remained: sound as cohesion. The rhythm brought people together even when words divided them. In moments of ceremony or grief, the collective breath of a crowd could be stilled by a single note sustained in the air. Leaders understood that music could move where authority could not, into the heart, into the quiet of memory. A melody could outlast any command. It could be hummed long after speeches were forgotten. It could cross borders without permission. In this way, music remained both loyal and free, both a symbol of structure and a whisper of something larger than power. Across the world, from the measured harmonies of Europe to the deep drums of Africa, from the trembling strings of Asia to the clear brass of the Americas, music spoke of collective rhythm, not of rule, but of endurance. The tone might differ, but the purpose was the same: to remind humanity that we move best when we move together. The quiet beneath the noise. Even as the music of order filled the great halls and open squares, another sound endured, smaller, softer, closer to the ground. The quiet songs of workers, the hums of mothers, the low chants of travelers around fires. These were not songs of power, but of presence. They carried no law, no ceremony, only the simple truth that people continued to live, to breathe, to feel. While the state created sound to shape the world, the people made music to live within it. One was for permanence, the other for survival. Between them, a balance formed, the rhythm of control above and the rhythm of endurance below. When night fell over the cities and the grand music faded into the dark, it was the smaller melodies that remained, the soft tapping of fingers on wood, the quiet hum beneath breath, the faint tune remembered from childhood. These were the true foundations of the world's sound, fragile, constant, human. Music had been used to build power, to preserve order, to shape nations. But it had never stopped being the same simple force it had always been, the movement of breath through time. And when the echoes of ceremony died, and the crowds dispersed, and the air returned to stillness, only one rhythm remained, as it always had. The steady pulse beneath all sound, reminding the world that before power, before progress, before everything, there was listening. The machines and the mind, music in the age of industry. The first mechanical sounds. The new world began not with silence, but with a different kind of rhythm. It was not the heartbeat of men or the pulse of the earth, but the slow, relentless breath of machines, the hum of engines, the hiss of steam, the clang of metal upon metal. These became the music of progress. The age of industry was born not in melody, but in motion. At first, people resisted the noise. It was too constant, too hard, too sharp against the stillness of the old world. But over time, their ears adjusted. The turning of gears, the measured thud of pistons, the low rumble of trains became familiar, almost soothing. Each factory carried its own percussion, each workshop its own rhythm. Humanity had found a new metronome, mechanical, tireless, eternal. The workers moved to it without thought. The body, ever obedient to rhythm, began to follow. The hammer struck in time, the hands lifted and lowered, the breath matched the pace of production. Even fatigue found its measure. The world had become a song of repetition, steady, efficient, endless. Outside, cities rose around this rhythm, streets filled with footsteps and wheels, bells rang, horns called, whistles signaled beginnings and endings. The sound of life grew louder, layered, more complex. Yet within all this, the human pulse persisted, smaller now but still there, keeping time beneath the weight of progress. Music for the machine age. As the mechanical world expanded, so too did its music. Instruments multiplied, mirroring the noise of invention. The piano became the symbol of control, strings struck by hammers, precision hidden within beauty. Orchestras grew larger, their sections swelling like engines in motion, blending human breath with mechanical power. Composers began to listen differently. They heard rhythm in the factories, harmony in the hum of electricity, melody in the whistle of steam. The noise of the age was transformed into structure. Dissonance made deliberate, chaos shaped into art. Music no longer belonged only to the gentle or the graceful. It belonged to movement itself. Marches carried the pulse of production, symphonies imitated the turning of machines. The past had sung of nature and gods, the present sang of power and precision. Yet, even within this iron harmony, emotion endured. Beneath the brass and percussion, the same ancient ache remained, the longing for stillness, the echo of a heartbeat beneath the roar of the world. Humanity had surrounded itself with sound, but somewhere deep inside, it still listened for silence. The rise of recorded sound. For the first time, music could be captured, taken from the air and stored within glass, within grooves, within wire. A voice that once disappeared into the night could now be heard again and again and again. The invention of recording did not just change how people listened, it changed what music was. Before, every song was fleeting. Once it ended, it lived only in memory. Now, sound could be repeated perfectly, preserved like time itself, refusing to fade. The breath of a singer, the strike of a key, the resonance of a drum, all could be held forever. The first recordings were fragile, their quality faint and ghost-like. But within that imperfection was wonder. For the first time, a person could listen to the past. They could hear what had already vanished. The distance between moment and memory dissolved. Music no longer needed a performer. It no longer needed a place. It became portable, intimate, infinite. The hum of machines gave birth to a quieter revolution, the ability to hold sound inside silence. People gathered around phonographs the way their ancestors had gathered around fires. They leaned close, eyes closed, as if listening to another world. And in a way, they were. The pulse of the city. The cities of the industrial age became living instruments. Streets vibrated with rhythm, lights flickered in tempo, crowds moved in synchronized waves. The chaos of progress was not without music. It was music, just one that demanded a different kind of listening. The night was no longer quiet. The factory lamps burned through the darkness, and the streets sang with machinery and motion. Steam hissed, hooves clattered, trains murmured like restless beasts. The air was thick with sound, and within it, people began to dream differently. Composers like Satie, Debussy, and later Cage and Reich, they all heard it. The pulse of modernity, the endless drone beneath human life. They translated it into new forms. Minimalist, abstract, mechanical, yet deeply human. Music no longer described emotion. It became a reflection of awareness, a mirror to the modern mind. And through all of it, people sought stillness. As the noise of the world grew, so did the need for calm. Quiet songs emerged, slow and gentle, written not to be performed, but to be lived. Music for rest, music for sleep, music to remind the body how to breathe. The inner machine. As technology advanced, the rhythm of the machine moved inward. Electricity flowed not just through cities, but through homes, through hearts, through thought. The modern human became both listener and instrument, part organic, part mechanical. The hum of life became electrical. The pulse of cities matched the pulse of circuits. Sound traveled faster, farther, quieter. Music became digital, a pattern of numbers, a translation of breath into code. It could now exist without space, without time, reaching ears that the singer would never see. And yet, even now, in this age of infinite sound, the rhythm remains the same. Beneath the layers of data and signal, the heartbeat continues, slow, patient, human. The machine learned to imitate it, but could never replace it. For all its power, it still follows the ancient tempo, the one that began before words, before history, before thought. The quiet of all things. Now the world is quiet again. The great engines have slowed, the streets have emptied, and even the wind seems to rest. What remains is the oldest rhythm of all, the heartbeat, the breath, the sound of life continuing softly beneath the silence. Every pulse carries the memory of those who came before, every breath a faint echo of the music that has followed humanity through time. Somewhere in the dark, the earth still hums. It is not the song of machines or cities or triumphs, but the deep, low murmur of existence itself, steady, patient, eternal. You can feel it if you listen closely, beneath your chest in the rise and fall of your breathing. It is the same rhythm that guided the first voices, the same quiet that lived beneath the drums of ancient firelight, the same peace that moved through the flutes, the strings, the whispers of every age. Now all those sounds fold together, the songs of tribes and empires, of fields and factories, of the human heart and the turning stars, merging into one gentle tone. A sound too vast to name, too calm to disturb. It moves through you, across you, around you, as constant as the tide, as soft as memory. And as it settles, you begin to drift, not backward, not forward, but into the slow current of time itself. The world exhales, and you exhale with it. The last remnants of noise fade into warmth, into stillness, into rest.
So let that sound carry you.
Let it wrap around your thoughts like a quiet blanket, until they dissolve into air. Let it guide you towards sleep, slow, steady, without effort. The way history has always carried humanity through the centuries, through silence, through music, through the calm heart of time. Now breathe. The world is at rest, and the music, the oldest music, continues softly within you.